Alright, salutogenic discoveries, the social side. And before we move on further, I want to say this, right? Just kind of get a bit of a coverage. I hope that you agree with me that what we covered in the previous 7 discoveries, and of course I've really kind of chunked them together and I didn't even go into the more specific nuances of the relationship with fascia, how it ties in with fitness and all this, all these things. Like I even just brushed on them. There's lots more. But I hope that even that you can see how everything ties together, how beautiful and elegant the salutogenic perspective is. But of course, the way that I bring this interpretation for you, if you will flip through the existing salutogenic literature, well, you're not going to find much of this, right? Because actually, by now it's been more or less the whole salutogenic approach has been kind of, shall I say, hijacked by the public health department. It's popular there, but they're preaching it to a completely wrong crowd. Basically, they are preaching it to the people who are neglecting their own health, and they're trying to tell me, guys, we're going to bring you literacy. Your health is important. But I believe it's a wrong crowd. It has to be the other way. The power of the salutogenesis is not in preaching to the people who are illiterate and actually prefer to stay illiterate, right? But it's to the people who actually have the drive, have the basic literacy in health, but want to get more. It's the tool of striving for excellence, right? But it's difficult for medicine, right? Because medicine fundamentally being this, like the whole history of medicine is not about striving for excellence and going forwards and going towards it. It's about being defensive, being anti-pathogenic and so on. So that's the trouble there. And the way that I do this, right, is that actually it's a good opportunity. I was thinking about this a lot. It's like it helps to understand, like, how do I get all this? It's the method that I have, basically, I would call it the scientific knowledge transplantation, right? I am a scientific knowledge transplantologist, right? So what I do, it's quite simple. Think about it this way. There are different branches of science, and different branches of science have different quality. If you think about the knowledge base, the fundamental wisdom architecture, there are sciences where it's high, and there are sciences where it's low. So, but they're all protected, like with the borders of the language and so on. So people just exist on different compartments. They never come across. So that protects the sciences or the departments of knowledge or like domains which are low on wisdom. So if we use this expression, what I call the wisdom quotient, right, the WQ. So like reality is, in medicine, the WQ, the wisdom quotient, is extremely low. And the more you go into the specifics of like pathologies, the worse it becomes. And unfortunately, the reality is that if you look at the cerebral palsy department, this is where the wisdom quotient, the quality of the knowledge is terrible. Let's face it. And that's what GMFCS curves is about. That's the reality. Now, the thing is, what I'm doing a simple thing. I'm looking for the other branches with the other sciences with the higher wisdom quotient. For instance, like theory of relativity, extremely high wisdom quotient. So you try to import things from one domain into another. You can also call it, knowledge hacking, knowledge knowledge gold digging, doesn't matter. I mean, that's the way it is. I prefer the term interdisciplinary knowledge arbitrage, right? So when you you leverage the wisdom from one domain into another. So salutogenesis is by far, by a huge margin, is the best theoretical framework. Is it's just skyrocketed in terms of the wisdom quotient comparing to anything that you have in medical field. It's dramatic improvement. But the thing is, it has emerged into this field of the public health where, what are these people? These are the doctors, but not even practical doctors. These are the doctors which are preaching some public policy. It's a bureaucratic mix, unfortunately. So, and again, the crowd that they're preaching is not the most rewarding crowd. They're basically distributing brochures: don't smoke, don't drink, eat well, and do stuff like this, right? So, what I was doing for this entire field was actually deconstructing what I call the salutogenic blueprint. I have taken the original concept expressed in the original words, right? Peeled off the words, deconstructed the fundamentals, and then replanted them into our field. And that's what I always do, right? So that's what I do with everything. That's how I come with any sort of idea, right? I'm like, whether it's technical or whether it's theoretical. Again, the eggs or anything like this. I found, there is something which is being the discovery in the chemical field. What are we doing? We're bringing this discovery from a chemical field into the cerebral palsy. What is this? This is the arbitrage, right? The transplantation of knowledge or the tools from one field into another. Now, but getting back to this. And that's how I always work. But getting back to the salutogenesis itself, and then I got back to this and say, because the essence of the salutogenesis, as it stands now, is the notion which is called the sense of coherence. So what does it mean? I mean, if we get back in history, so where does this whole thing come from? Dr. Antonovsky, who is the founder of the salutogenesis, what did he study? So where did it come from, right? He actually he interviewed in the 1960s and 70s, he interviewed a significant number of the Israeli women in particular who survived the concentration camps of the World War II. And there were dozens of them that he interviewed and so on. So if you think about it, this is, in hindsight, right? This is the most brutal experiment that has ever been made in the recorded history of mankind. And hopefully it's never going to be repeated, right? And to a certain extent it's our, duty to get the most of it, right? To put it to good use, not to let it sort of be thrown in vain. And what he faced is that actually if you go through the classic pathogenic notion, what you would expect. So these people, these women, they had significant, really troubled experiences, and a lot of them, they were just children, like young teenagers when they got into that concentration camp. So they, for 3-4 years, right, so they've been experienced to terrible living conditions, fear, oppression, like really like hardest possible manual labor and so on and so forth. And to his surprise, instead of these people showing the signs of wear and tear, of some destructive impacts on their personality and their accumulated effects of stress and so on, there was a certain significant enough number of them who were actually showing the ability to thrive. they were happy and healthy. And that was really a remarkable thing for him. And he said, well, how the hell did that happen? How did these people manage to thrive under those unimaginably harsh conditions? And that's where he proceeded to analyze those things, and that's how he actually came with this notion of their deep internal stress converter being what he called the sense of coherence, known as SOC or SOC, right? So where you have the three key components. One is meaningfulness, so making sense out of the situations, right? So basically being able to convert the stresses into what could be seen as challenges, being worthy of doing things, right? Second part was the comprehensibility. So comprehensibility, that's the ability to deconstruct it and understand the whole framework, what goes where. So that's more the intellectual part, right? And the third component being the manageability. So this is more like the resourcefulness and being able to execute the plan which comes in here, right? So that would be more the why, that's the what, and that's the how part. And all these things tied in together, that's what he labeled as the sense of sense of coherence. And this is really, I first deconstructed it and so, but then it really clicked on me. I say, wow, if you think about it, what do we have? We have this extremely clear scenario that actually ABR as the method is the fit for the parents, for the individuals who have this high sense of coherence. And once I've kind of realized that and said, wow, this is really, an amazing thing, because it clarifies everything. It's really instantly relieved me out of the frustrations that bugged me forever, right? Because again, sense of coherence is the stress converter. It's the ability to convert stress into the positive and self-fueling experiences. And there are two things which bugged me in particular, right, over the years. One is that, I'm not a very diplomatic person, and I tend to explain everything bluntly and plainly and so on. And, well, what happens is that on the one hand, we have family, like a family, right, coming to us, and we explain things and so on, that it's going to be a marathon, that it's a hard work and all these things, and you get to get organized and so on. And what happens? A family starts, and then maybe 3-4 months later, they drop out. Or maybe half a year later, they drop out. I said, gee, guys, why did you start in first place? That would be my reaction. Everything has been explained to you. So how come that you actually bothered to start doing it? And the second scenario is actually a bit different, and it's even, to begin with, it's a bit more frustrating. And we've faced not once and not twice the situations where a family would start and actually would go on maybe a first year, or maybe even a bit more, 12, 18 months, and achieve the level of tangible results. Clear and obvious results. You look at the before and after pictures, it's clear and obvious for everyone around. But then, at some point, they start backing off. And you see intelligent people coming with all sorts of, let's be honest, lousiest excuses. Well, the child doesn't want it anymore. I feel tired, we're starting school. I say, gee, guys, don't you know about the GMFCS curves? It's a straightforward thing. You are beating the curves. You're actually you are putting your child a completely different level of prognosis here. So what's what's the trouble? Like, what bugs you? Why is it happening? And, you know, I was trying to bring more explanations and so on and so on. But now, with the sense of coherence, everything becomes very clear. Because there are two essential components there to this sense of coherence, right? So one is the actual level, like how high is that sense of coherence as this fuel, right? And the other component is how well those three elements are integrated inside it, right? So one thing is the total height, right? As the other one is this. So in the first scenario, what we are seeing, this is the family who, from the personality standpoint, they simply didn't have enough of this sense of coherence level. It's too low. So for them, bringing themselves over this kind of bump of getting through, you know, if they're there, getting through the bump, that didn't work. So they couldn't put things together, right? And in everything in nature is about getting over the bump. Like, you know, if you get food, before the food is being digested and actually you get energy out of it, well, first you have to spend energy to go over the bump. That happens in everything. So that's no different in here. You know, before you can gain knowledge out of books, you have to overcome the bump of getting literate, and so on and so forth. So that's one clear point. To be able to stick to ABR, you actually need this sense of coherence high enough. But on the other hand, it's a different scenario. So when we look at this scenario, what do we have? Most often, most of the families that come to us, right? And most of the families with the cerebral palsy kids would be having this part, right? The meaningfulness, the drive would be particularly high. So you want to do it for your child. So you have this deep sense of meaningfulness. But at the same time, what happens? It's like a subsidy. And if you can't build the other two components, if they're too disconnected, at some point, when the initial subsidy wears off and those two other components are not built in, what happens? You run out of steam. And actually, what happens? It becomes the whole ABR experience, or this continuous activation becomes a stress for you. So basically, instead of building this, right, instead of building this de-stress, eustress, there is this, yeah. Instead of being able to convert the stress into the eustress, it becomes stress going into the de-stress. So it becomes like it eats away from you. It doesn't add to you. So, and this is really critical, right? You know, because, again, you know, some people to whom I talked about the salutogenesis, at first glance, you say, well, you know, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Of course, to be able to do something, you need to find it meaningful. Well, you have to understand things and you have to be able to manage things, right? It's not a big deal. But actually, the biggest deal about the entire salutogenesis is this fundamental understanding that depending on where these components are, it's going to bring in this different response to stresses, to the point that if this sense of coherence is high enough, it serves as a converter. And this is the critical point, right? So as the family, as you're always going to be under stress. But what is going to happen is the key thing. If the sense of coherence is A, high enough, B, all these components are linked together, then you are able to fuel yourself over the process. And then it becomes the growing experience there. Of course, at the back of your mind, you might say, you would always, all of us, right? We would want to get some, you know, sympathy, subsidy, and so on and so forth. But if you have this component, that's the driver that converts it, actually your own economy grows. So, and that's the thing. If that's happening, your own economy grows on the biological, not only on the social, but on the biological level. And at the same time, well, what we have is that if that connection is poor, then at a certain point of time, intelligent people would be bringing really lamest excuses. And now it's easy to understand why. Because, your losses, this weakness at the sense of coherence, at the social, right, at the emotional level, translates into the biological losses. So something starts like growing, the protest, the intrinsic protest starts growing from deep within. And it doesn't really matter for you. You bring a large, a person brings a large repertoire of excuses, which, if you step back, don't make much sense. Somehow they managed before, but that's how it clicks. So this is the first point. Very straightforward, very clear, and of course this is what we're going to bring in more, right? There are those questionnaires for the determining of the sense of coherence. We are going to pay a lot more attention. We're inviting you guys to pay more attention to this, right? And really study things. But this really helps to understand who ABR is for and who ABR is not for, right? And the critical thing here is that the ABR difference is not about the child, right? It's about the family, it's about the parent, it's about the sense of coherence that exists there. And this is, again, ABR as a physical tool, it works for everybody as the salutary tool. It works for every channel. But the thing is that in order to build this experience, the family needs to have this sense of coherence high enough to be able to convert that experience into the build rather than into the drain, so that their economy would grow rather than contract and actually, leak off. So, I hope that helps, right? But this brings us into the next component. Now, suppose this sense of coherence is high, but there is more troubles, because actually, it's, there are more caveats there. And I've labeled it this way: the Amundsen way versus the Scott way, right? I've borrowed it from the book, thing called Great by Design. It's the business book, from the famous author who wrote the Good to Great. So, but that's a strong import here. Let me explain. The Amundsen and Scott, who were those guys? Those were the South Pole discoverers. So this guy, Amundsen, was Norwegian. He made it and made it there, and he came back. Scott was American, and his expedition was a disaster. Now, what's the key difference between them, and what's this? So why it's an important point? Now, as I said already, each and every of you have this strong meaningfulness there. It's important. It's the essential visceral drive that brings you in, that forces you to work with your child. And it's really, if you think about it logically, I'll begin. I'm not diplomatic, I'll be blunt. Think about it. Like, on a face value, there's no reason for you, especially if you have other kids, if you are, if you have a quadriplegic child, there's no logical reason for you to go through those ordeals. Frankly speaking, it's extra stress, it's extra strain, you're worse off in everything. Economically, emotionally, and so on. And at the same time, there is the entire industry which is offering you guys, pass your child to the institution. We're going to take care of them. He's going to have all the best care, and we're going to get all the medical support and so on. Why don't you do this? Well, again, people who are listening to me now, you are the people with this strong sense of coherence. So for you, it just, well, it's wrong. And that's enough. When I kind of probe people for this, I say, well, it's my child. That's it. That's enough as the explanation. And that means that this is this deep, visceral connection, right? Really deep, really strong bond. But this strong bond and this visceral connection is a powerful fuel. Very powerful fuel. But at the same time, it's a dangerous fuel. Because what happens is that this visceral connection that you have with your child and this visceral reasoning, it's like a nuclear power. It could be extremely powerful, but what you need the right engine to convert it. Because if you don't have the right engine, it's not working well. It's a mismatch, right? You put the nuclear power in the internal combustion engine, boom, it just blown away. Because what happens when you have this strong sense of coherence with the meaningfulness component, you would have the tendency to do a heroic deed, right? Like, put everything together, make one-off big attempt, and let's say really like sacrifice yourself. How many times have I heard this? If I had a chance to sacrifice myself for the child, I would have done it, without thinking twice. If I had a brain injury and my child got recovered, I would be happy to make this trade-off. I heard this not once. So this is the sacrifice mentality. And the problem with the sacrifice mentality is this. It's not broaden and build. It's the one which calls for the drastic action. The one which kind of enhances the miracle thinking. The one that enhances this no pain, no gain thinking and so on. And this is a destructive point. This is really huge, right? So that's why it's so essential for the salutary department. Salutary department is about converting, finding your range of stresses that you are able to convert in the small steps. And this is how it's different from the classic underdog story, right? The classic underdog story is that, a guy who has been bullied and then decided to build muscle, right? And kind of kick some ass there, right? Or, some person who wanted to escape poverty or something else. So you've got all these stories which actually glorifying the powerful, the willpower, right? The willpower is an immense resource. And that's very big difference with the sense of coherence, right? So you see the differences in the nuances, but those nuances are critical. Because with the sense of coherence, what we're talking about, we're not talking about this extraordinary willpower. We are not talking about the self-sacrifice. Because that's destructive. This is where you are able to, borrow from your future, borrow from your past, sell off your assets and say, well, I'm going to sell off this and try to buy that. You are not earning, right? So this is the critical distinction. High sense of coherence on the meaningfulness side tends to bring the sacrifice, tends to bring this thing that instead of the consistent, smooth building of the economy, you actually want to make this jump. And well, the reality of the biological reality, this jump doesn't exist. 24 months for the collagen cycles, right? Cycle after cycle, daily cycle, with the day and night and so on and so forth. So you have to be able to invest, and this investment has to have those small cycles. So where you're able to get from the panic zone, right, from the subsidy zone, right? So subsidy zone, you're able to move into the learning and earning zone. That's what you want. And this is the difference, as I said, with the underdog story. Because the underdog story is borrowing from the willpower, and this story of the sense of coherence is the gradual broaden and build. And that's why it's so important for you to develop all the tiny components there, the components of the attention to detail, the components of gradual improvement of skill, the component of being able to pay attention and so on and so forth. Because here, this type of the nuclear power mentality, it encourages you to say, well, I'm able to toughen it up and say, if you promise me the cure in 10 years, I'm going to toughen it up. Wrong. Never going to work. You're never going to get the resources on the one hand, but on the other hand, you are not going to make it through. Because this is powered this way. This is the trickiest element of the whole thing. Again, we're dealing with the really, high quality people, the people with a lot of dignity, with a lot of compassion to the child and so on. But unless this powerful energy is converted correctly through the right engine, this is not going to work. So this is really important thing to understand. It's not only about the sense of coherence itself, it's about converting it correctly. And if we get back to the Amundsen way versus the Scott way, the answer is very straightforward. So Scott was the guy who really wanted to get to the South Pole, but he wanted to get there in one swift action, putting all his last resources together. And Amundsen is the guy who actually made, I don't remember, something like 10-year preparation. So he was trying all sorts of dogs. Which dogs would be better to pull the sled? He went to Alaska and experimented there. He went to Greenland and experimented there. He made some test runs and said, under these types of weather conditions and how many days we're able to cover this distance. So he was probably a boring guy, right? If you think of it as, heroic deeds. But he made it, and it was also, about the supplies, right? So he took the extra supplies, he accounted for what can go wrong, and so on and so forth. So basically, that was the whole story, right? He was able to put all the nuances together, all the elements together. And this is what I would encourage you to do, right? I'll be encouraging you to develop in this direction, in the direction of the Amundsen way, paying attention to detail, building up your own resources, your skill, your understanding of your movement, your child, your ability to track changes, your ability to stack those changes up, your ability to understand how all these elements evolve and so on, and not to come with the lousy, excuses for yourself. We believe, I'm going to toughen up, I'm going to trust, and so on, because all these are subsidies. These are not the right engines. This is not the conversion of the stress into the eustress. So that's the discovery number 9. And now we're moving to the last part, for this time, which is going to be the discovery number 10.